The sun was a hammer. It beat down on the parched land, cracking the earth into 1,000 dry veins. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. It settled on the warped timbers of the porch, on the brittle leaves of the lone cottonwood tree, and on the faded calico of Clara Mayfield's dress. It was a taste in the back of her throat, a grit between her teeth. This was the only world she knew, a world of brown and gray, bleached by a relentless sky. She stood on the porch, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white stones. She did not look at her father, who sat on the steps, cleaning a rifle that was already clean. She did not look at her mother, who moved behind the grimy window of the cabin like a ghost, her face a pale blur. Instead, Clara watched the horizon, that wavering line where the heat distorted the world into a shimmering mirage. She was waiting. They were all waiting. The sound came first, a faint, rhythmic beat carried on the dry wind. Hoofbeats, a single rider. The sound grew steadily, a slow drum announcing her fate. Her father, Josiah, stopped his polishing. He laid the rifle across his lap, his hands resting on the warm steel. He still did not look at her. At 22, Clara felt ancient. She had been a wife for 2 years and a widow for 1, though her husband, Elias, wasn't dead. He had simply left, riding out one morning for the promise of gold in the California hills, his parting words echoing in the dusty street of their small town. "The woman is barren," he'd declared to anyone who would listen. "A field that won't grow seed is worthless to a farmer." The shame had followed Clara home like a stray dog, clinging to her skirts, sleeping at the foot of her bed. It was a shame her family wore as well, a stain on their name in a world where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could provide. And so, a deal had been made. A letter had arrived from a rancher a week's ride south, near the desert lands. A man whose wife and child had been taken by the fever. He needed a woman for the work. He didn't care about sons. He just needed a pair of hands. The letter had been blunt, stripped of all sentiment. So was the arrangement. Her father had negotiated the price, $30 silver, the cost of a good horse. The rider was close now, a dark shape resolving itself out of the heat haze. A tall man on a tall, dark horse. He moved with a kind of weary purpose, his body swaying with the animal's gait. He wore a dusty hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He knew what he was coming for. It wasn't going anywhere. Clara forced herself to breathe. The air was hot and thin, searing her lungs. She thought of the small box under her cot, the one holding the few things she had considered her own. A book of poems with a pressed wildflower inside, its purple long faded to a dusty brown. Her mother's wedding ring, given to her on her own wedding day, which she had been made to give back yesterday. A small, carved bird Elias had made for her during their courtship, a time that felt like it belonged to another person's life. She had left the bird on her pillow this morning, a final, silent surrender. The horse stopped at the foot of the porch steps. The man did not dismount. He looked from Josiah to Clara, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before returning to her father. His face, what she could see of it, was weathered and hard. Not cruel, but as if life had stripped everything soft from him. Mayfield, the man's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Josiah stood up. He was a tall man, but stooped, as if carrying a great weight. "That's me. You're Kane." The man nodded once. Wyatt Kane. He said his name like a simple fact, like the color of the sky or the heat of the sun. There was no room for discussion. The two men looked at each other, a silent negotiation of pride and necessity passing between them. Josiah's gaze flickered to Clara for the briefest of moments, his expression unreadable, before he looked away again, towards the endless, empty plains. "She's healthy," Josiah said, his voice flat. "Strong. Can work all day." Wyatt Kane's eyes moved to Clara again. She felt the weight of his gaze, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a farmer inspects livestock. He was checking her teeth, her hide, her potential for labor. She stood straighter, refusing to flinch. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had done all her breaking in the dark, silent hours of the night. "The letter said she's unable," Cain said, the word hanging in the hot air. "The Lord's will is what it is," Josiah answered, a bitter edge to his voice. "She was married 2 years. Nothing came of it. She is barren." The word, spoken aloud by her own father, was a physical blow. Clara felt the air leave her body. Barren. An empty vessel. A dry well. It was the branding iron that had marked her, turning her from a daughter into a commodity. Wyatt Cain seemed to consider this. He looked at Clara's hands, noting the calluses. He looked at her straight back, the set of her jaw. He seemed to see past the shame and find something else, something solid. After a long moment, he reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Josiah. The sound of the coins clinking together was unnaturally loud in the silence. It was the sound of a closing door, the final turn of a key in a lock. Josiah caught the pouch. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had weighed its promise in his mind 100 times. He tucked it into his belt, his movements stiff. "Her things," Cain said. It was not a question. "She has a small bundle inside," Josiah replied, jerking his head toward the cabin door. Clara did not move. She waited for a word, a glance, a sign that she had ever been more than a burden to this man who was her father. She looked at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the weathered skin of his neck. She saw a stranger. Wyatt Cain finally dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud. He was taller than she had realized, broad in the shoulders, but lean, as if the land had whittled him down to pure sinew and bone. He walked with a slight limp. He stopped in front of her. "Get your bundle," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was devoid of any emotion. It was an instruction. Clara turned and walked into the cabin. The dim interior smelled of wood smoke and boiled cabbage. Her mother stood by the cold hearth, her back to the room, her shoulders shaking. She was crying, but she did it silently, as she did everything, so as not to cause a fuss. Clara walked to her cot and picked up the small bundle tied with twine. It contained a change of clothes, a comb, and a small bar of soap. Everything a worthless woman owned. She walked back to the door and paused, looking at her mother's back. For a moment, she wanted to say something, to bridge the chasm of silence that had grown between them over the past year. But what was there to say? "Goodbye. Thank you. I'm sorry I failed you." The words were ash in her mouth. She stepped back out onto the porch, into the blinding sunlight. Her father had moved to the far end of the porch, his back to them all, staring out at the land he had sold his daughter to keep. Wyatt Cain took the bundle from her without a word and tied it to the back of his saddle. He put his hands on his hips and looked at his new purchase. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice a little more than a whisper. He nodded, then turned to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy, practiced motion. He looked down at her, then extended a hand. It was a large, calloused hand, stained with dirt and work. It was the hand of a man who wrestled a living from an unforgiving earth. It was a hand that expected nothing and offered nothing but a practical purpose. Clara put her hand in his. His grip was firm and dry. He pulled her up behind him, her legs scraping against the rough leather of the saddle. She settled herself, her dress bunching up around her thighs. She had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance. His back was hard and warm through the thin fabric of his shirt. He smelled of horse, leather, and dust. It was the scent of her new life. Wyatt Cain did not look back. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward, moving into a steady walk. Clara did not look back either. She couldn't bear to see the cabin shrinking in the distance, to see her father standing there with the silver in his belt, to see the ghost of her mother in the window. She had already been erased. She faced forward, into the shimmering heat and the vast, empty expanse of the horizon. The rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves was the only sound in the world. Each hoofbeat was a step away from everything she had known, a step into a future as blank and unforgiving as the landscape stretching out before her. The sun beat down on her head, and the dust rose in a cloud behind them, settling over their tracks, wiping them clean, as if they had never been there at all. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The sun climbed the sky, hung directly overhead like a malevolent eye, and then began its slow descent toward the jagged, distant mountains. The landscape did not change. It was an endless, rolling expanse of rock and dust and skeletal shrubs that clawed at the dry air. Clara's body ached. The muscles in her back and thighs were screaming, and her skin was raw where it rubbed against the saddle and the unyielding wall of Wyatt Kane's back. He did not speak a single word, not one. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves, the creak of the leather saddle, and the whisper of the hot wind. He rode with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He seemed a part of the horse, a part of the land itself, as silent, as hard, as unforgiving. Clara felt less like a person and more like a parcel he was transporting. Her arms, locked around his waist, felt the tension in his body, the hard ridges of muscle that moved with every step of the horse. It was an intimacy without feeling, a closeness born of pure necessity. Twice, he stopped. The first time was by a trickle of a stream, its water murky and warm. He dismounted, filled a canteen, and drank deeply. He offered it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment she felt a spark of something, like static in the dry air. But his face was impassive. She drank, the water tasting of mud and life, and handed it back. He watered the horse, then swung back into the saddle, pulling her up behind him as if she weighed nothing. The second stop was as the sun began to bleed orange and purple across the horizon. He took a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag, broke it in two, and handed her a piece. They ate in silence, the dry biscuit scraping their throats. Darkness fell quickly, a thick, star-dusted blanket that did nothing to cool the air. The land was now a formless void. Clara could see nothing but the faint outline of the horse's head and the imposing shadow of the man in front of her. She found herself drifting in and out of a weary, jolting sleep, her head occasionally resting against his back. Each time, she would jerk awake, a hot flush of shame rising in her. But he gave no sign that he noticed or cared. It was well past midnight when the horse's gait changed. It slowed, and she could feel it picking its way over more uneven ground. A shape began to emerge from the blackness, darker than the surrounding night. A structure, then another, smaller one, a fence line, stark and skeletal under the moonlight. They had arrived. He stopped the horse in front of the larger structure, a low-slung cabin that seemed to sag under the weight of the sky. He dismounted and, without offering his hand this time, waited for her to slide down. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground. They were stiff and numb. She leaned against the horse for a moment, its warm, sweaty hide a comfort. Wyatt Kane untied her bundle and his own saddlebags. He slung them over his shoulder. He walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. It swung inward with a low groan. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light making Clara flinch. He lit a lantern that sat on a crude table just inside the door. The yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing the world she had been sold into. And it was a world of emptiness. The shock of it was a cold fist in her gut. She had grown up in poverty, in a cabin crowded with too many siblings and too few comforts. But that was a poverty of means. This was a poverty of the soul. The cabin was a single, large room. In the center stood a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs. Against one wall was a stone hearth, black with soot. A few pieces of wood stacked beside it. In the far corner was a bed frame, topped with a thin mattress and a gray, threadbare blanket, and that was all. There were no curtains on the single window, no rug on the packed earth floor, no shelves holding preserves or dishes, no decorations on the rough plank walls. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disuse, a cold, still air that suggested no one had truly lived here for a very long time. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a place to keep the wind out. Wyatt Kane dropped the saddlebags onto the table with a heavy thud. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. She could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, but looked older. Lines were carved around his eyes and mouth, etched by sun and sorrow. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky. They held no warmth, only a deep, bottomless weariness. He saw her looking around, taking in the stark emptiness. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's not much," he stated, his voice a low rumble. Clara could not find her own voice. She just nodded. He seemed to take that as an answer. He walked over to the hearth and gestured toward it with his chin. "I need someone to cook and to keep the fire," he said. The words were simple, blunt. They were the terms of her contract, the definition of her existence here. She was not a wife. She was not a companion. She was a function, a pair of hands to perform a task. It was exactly what her father had sold her as, and exactly what this man had bought. The honesty of it was both brutal and, in a strange way, a relief. There were no pretenses here. "The well is out back," he continued, his tone flat and instructional. "Firewood is stacked against the west wall. There's flour and salt pork in that crate." He pointed to a wooden box in the corner she hadn't noticed. "You sleep there." He gestured to a pile of folded blankets on the floor near the hearth, as far from his own bed as possible. He seemed to consider his duties as her new owner, complete. He took a tin cup from his saddlebag, filled it with water from a bucket by the door, and drank. He then walked to his bed, pulled off his boots, and lay down, fully clothed, turning his back to her and the room. Within minutes, the steady rhythm of his breathing filled the silence. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the empty room. The lantern light cast her long, wavering shadow on the wall. She was alone, but not alone, trapped in an intimate space with a stranger who was now the master of her life. She felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown her. She had been cast out, sold, and delivered to this hollowed-out place to serve a hollowed-out man. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she walked to the pile of blankets that was to be her bed. She laid them out on the hard floor. She was too exhausted to feel the discomfort. She untied her bundle but did not take anything out. What was the point? There was no place to put anything, no corner of this empty life to make her own. She lay down, pulling a rough woolen blanket over her. It smelled faintly of him, of leather and dust. She stared into the darkness, listening to his breathing, to the scuttling of some small creature in the walls, to the vast, overwhelming silence of the land outside. This was her new reality. A barren woman in a barren house, bought by a man who wanted nothing from her but warmth and food. It was, she thought with a terrible clarity, a fitting end. But as the days bled into one another, Clara began to see that the emptiness of the house was not a void. It was a presence. It was the shape of something that had been lost. Her curiosity, an emotion she thought had died in her, began to stir. Fragile as a winter moth, she found the first clue by accident, while sweeping the packed earth floor. Her broom caught on a loose floorboard near his bed. Prying it up with her fingers, she found a small, dark space beneath. Inside was a single object, a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. She picked it up, her heart hammering. The photograph was faded, the figures ghost-like, but she could make them out. A younger Wyatt Kane stood, his hand resting on the shoulder of a seated woman. He was smiling a real, genuine smile that transformed his hard face, making him look boyish and full of hope. The woman was beautiful, with dark hair piled high and a gentle expression. In her lap, she held a swaddled infant, its face a tiny, pale moon. A family. The family that had filled this empty house with life. Clara looked at the woman's face, at the love shining in her eyes as she looked down at her child, and felt a pang of something sharp and painful, a phantom limb of a feeling she had never been allowed to have. She carefully placed the photograph back in its hiding place and replaced the board. She never mentioned it. The second discovery was in a small, lean-to room built onto the back of the cabin, a room he never entered. It was being used for storage, filled with broken tools and old harnesses. Tucked away in a corner, under a pile of stiff, dusty canvas, was a small rocking chair. It was child-sized. Carved into the back, in crude but loving letters, were the initials S.K. One of the rockers was split, as if it had been thrown or kicked with great force. And then there was the crucifix. It hung on the wall above the space where his bed was. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved, and it was broken. The horizontal piece of the cross had been snapped cleanly in two, but the figure of Christ was still attached to the vertical beam. It hadn't been taken down. It had been left there, hanging askew, a symbol of a faith that had been shattered but not discarded, a testament to a rage and grief so powerful it had lashed out at God himself. Clara began to piece together the story the house was telling. This was not a place that had always been empty. It had been emptied. The silence was not an absence of sound. It was the echo of laughter and lullabies that were no more. The starkness was not a lack of possessions. It was a deliberate purging of anything that might hold a painful memory. Everything that remained the photo, the chair, the broken cross was a remnant of the wreckage, a sign of a loss so profound that it had scoured the man and his home, clean of all joy. And in understanding that, for the first time since she had arrived, Clara felt not fear of the silent rancher, but a flicker of something else, a shared understanding of the vast, empty spaces that loss leaves behind. Life settled into a rhythm as stark and unchanging as the landscape. It was a rhythm of silence. Wyatt Kane would rise before the sun, moving with a quiet efficiency that left no trace. By the time the first pale light crept over the horizon, he would be gone. A distant figure on his horse riding out to mend the fences or check on the few dozen head of cattle that constituted his ranch. He would be gone all day, a solitary ghost under the vast, empty sky. Clara's world was the cabin. She learned its sounds, its silences, its moods, the way the wind moaned around the corners in the afternoon, the way the floorboards creaked in a particular spot by the hearth, the way the light moved across the room. A slow, golden river marking the passage of hours. Her days were measured by tasks. She fetched water from the well, its bucket heavy and cold in the morning air. She swept the packed earth floor, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She kneaded dough for bread, her hands strong and capable, the scent of yeast a small, living comfort in the sterile air. She cooked. She learned what little he had and how to make it last. Salt pork, beans, flour, cornmeal. It was the food of survival, plain and honest. She would prepare a meal in the evening, setting a plate for him at the rough table. He would return at dusk, covered in the dust and sweat of his labor. He would wash his hands and face in the basin by the door, the water splashing softly. Then he would sit and eat. He ate without comment. He never said the food was good. He never said it was bad. He simply consumed it, his eyes fixed on his plate or on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. There was no gratitude in his silence, but there was no criticism either. It was a complete and total absence of acknowledgement. It was as if the food simply appeared, a natural function of the house, like the rising of the sun. In the beginning, this lack of thanks was a small, sharp sting. She had been raised to believe a woman's worth was in her service, and that service was meant to be recognized. But here, her efforts vanished into the same void that consumed everything else. After a week, the sting faded, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. She was not cooking for him. She was cooking to mark the end of a day. Their evenings were as silent as their meals. After eating, he would take a whetstone and a knife and sit on the porch steps, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the twilight. It was a lonely, meditative sound. Clara would clean the single pot and the 2 plates, her movements measured and quiet. She would then take up her mending, sitting in the chair by the hearth, her needle weaving in and out of the rough fabric of his shirts. They existed in the same small space, sometimes only a few feet apart, but the distance between them was as vast as the desert. They were 2 planets in a silent orbit, held together by a contract of mutual necessity, never touching. She learned to read his moods, not by his words, for there were none, but by the set of his shoulders or the way he moved. Some days he returned with a tension in him, so tight she felt it in the air, a low hum of restrained energy. On those days, he would work long after dark, chopping wood with a furious, controlled violence, the axe rising and falling in the moonlight until he was exhausted. Other days, he came back with a weariness that went bone deep, his movements slow, his eyes hollow. On those nights, he would barely eat before falling into his bed and sinking into a heavy, dreamless sleep. Clara found a strange kind of freedom in the silence. At her father's home, there had always been commands. At her first husband's house, there had been demands and criticisms. Here, there was nothing. No one told her what to do or how to do it. No one watched her, judged her, or found her wanting. Her existence was her own, circumscribed only by the practical needs of the day. She began to feel her own thoughts returning, thoughts she had long suppressed. She would stand at the door of the cabin and look out at the horizon, at the mountains that turned purple in the setting sun, and she would feel a quiet sense of self that had been absent for years. She was Clara, not a daughter, not a wife, not a failure, just Clara, a woman standing alone in a vast and silent land. It was a lonely feeling, but it was not entirely unwelcome. Then came the night she heard him cry. It was a moonless night, the stars so bright and close they seemed to have weight. A low wind had picked up, rattling a loose shutter on the window. Clara lay on her pallet, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting for sleep. Wyatt had been out on the porch for hours, long after he normally would have come in. She had assumed he was cleaning a saddle or mending a rein. The scraping sounds had stopped a while ago, replaced by the profound silence of the open plains. At first, she thought the sound was the wind or a distant coyote. It was a low, broken noise, almost too quiet to hear. She lay perfectly still, holding her breath, straining to listen. And then she heard it again. Unmistakable this time. It was the sound of a man weeping, a raw, guttural sound of grief, torn from a place so deep it was almost inhuman. It was not a sound of self-pity, but of pure, undiluted pain. It was the sound of a soul breaking. The sound came from the porch, from the spot where he sat every night. Clara's heart seized in her chest. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Fear, because the sound was so raw and uncontrolled. Pity, for a sorrow so immense it could make a man like Wyatt Kane break. And a deep, aching curiosity. This was the man who moved through the world like a force of nature, hard and silent. The man who faced the unforgiving land without flinching. The man who had bought her like she was a piece of equipment. To hear him like this, stripped bare of his armor, was to see a completely different person. The ghost of the smiling man in the photograph, the man who had lost everything, was suddenly real. She did not move. To go to him would be a violation, an intrusion into a private space he had never invited her into. She knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that to acknowledge his grief would be to shame him and destroy the fragile, silent truce that existed between them. So she lay there, a silent witness in the dark, and listened to the sounds of his heart breaking. The weeping went on for what felt like hours. It would stop, and she would think it was over. But then it would begin again, a fresh wave of agony. She thought of the broken crucifix on the wall. She imagined him, on the night he learned his wife and child were gone, his faith shattering in a single, violent moment. She thought of the child's rocking chair, kicked and broken. She thought of the photograph, hidden away under the floorboards like a secret wound. The pieces of his story, the story the house had told her, came together with this final, terrible sound. His silence was not emptiness. It was a wall he had built around a grief so vast he was afraid it would consume him. Eventually, the sounds subsided, replaced once more by the whisper of the wind. She heard the soft creak of the porch steps as he stood up. She heard his boots on the floorboards as he entered the cabin. She closed her eyes, feigning sleep, her body rigid. He moved through the darkness to his bed. She heard the rustle of his blanket as he lay down, but he did not sleep. She could feel his wakefulness in the dark, a tense, coiled presence. He was staring at the ceiling, or at the broken cross, lost in the wreckage of his past. She did not sleep that night either. She lay on her pallet, thinking. The man lying a few feet away from her was no longer just her owner, the silent rancher who had paid $30 silver for her. He was a person, drowning in a pain she was just beginning to understand. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of connection to him. Her own life had been a landscape of loss, the loss of love, the loss of hope, the loss of her own worth in the eyes of the world. Her grief was a quiet, smoldering thing compared to his raging fire. But it was grief all the same. They were two broken people living in a broken house, bound together by their shared silence. The next morning, nothing was different. He rose before dawn and was gone. He did not look at her. He did not speak, but for Clara, everything had changed. When she swept the floor, she felt she was tending to a fragile, sacred space. When she kneaded the bread, she felt she was providing a small measure of sustenance not just for his body, but for his wounded spirit. Her work was no longer a thankless chore. It was a silent act of witness. It was the only thing she could offer. Her curiosity about him grew into a quiet obsession. She started to watch him more closely, to notice the small things, the way his hands, though calloused and rough, were gentle with his horse, the way he would sometimes stop at the far end of the property and stare at two small, weathered wooden crosses on a low hill, standing there for a long time before turning away. She began to see the story of his pain written not just in the objects in the cabin, but in the very lines of his body, in the geography of his land. This ranch was not just a place of work, it was a graveyard, and he was its solitary keeper. She began to wonder about the woman in the photograph, what her name was, what her laugh had sounded like. She wondered about the child, S.K., whether it was a boy or a girl. They were ghosts in this house, and Clara was now living among them, the only one who seemed to know they were there. Her own life, her own past, began to feel very small in the face of his monumental sorrow. She was barren, yes, but her womb was not the only kind of empty space a person could carry inside them. The autumn rains came without warning. For weeks, the world had been baked brown and brittle under a sky of bleached blue. Then, one afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a cold, driving downpour that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud and hammered against the cabin's roof like 1,000 tiny fists. For the first time since Clara's arrival, they were trapped together for the entire day. The relentless rhythm of work that had defined their existence was broken. Wyatt sat at the table, mending a bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and awl. His presence filled the small cabin, making it feel even smaller. He was a silent, brooding mountain, and Clara felt the need to stay in motion, to fill the space with tasks so the silence wouldn't crush her. She had cleaned everything there was to clean. The hearth was swept, The pots were scrubbed, and the floor was as clean as packed earth could be. Her restless energy finally drove her to the one place she had not touched, the lean-to storage room at the back of the cabin. It was a damp, musty space, filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. She began to impose order on the chaos, stacking broken tools and neatly folding stiff canvases. In the far corner, half hidden under a pile of burlap sacks, was a large, flat-topped trunk. It was made of dark, heavy wood, bound with iron straps that were speckled with rust. It was the kind of trunk a family would use to carry all their worldly possessions across the country. It was not locked, but the lid was swollen from the damp and sealed shut, driven by a compulsion she didn't understand, a need to see into the heart of the home's emptiness. She worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a splintering crack, the lid gave way. The air that rose from the trunk was a sigh from the past. It smelled of dried lavender, old wool, and the faint, sweet scent of a life interrupted. Inside, things were neatly folded. On top lay a woman's church dress, made of dark blue wool, its collar trimmed with delicate, handmade lace. Beneath it was a man's suit, carefully preserved. Clara lifted them out, her movements slow and reverent. She was not cleaning now. She was excavating a life. Underneath the clothes was a small collection of books, their leather covers warped, and beside them, a small, carved wooden horse, its paint worn away by a child's hands. Tucked inside the curve of the horse's neck was a small, folded square of linen, a handkerchief. Clara picked it up. It was finer than anything she had ever owned, with the initials S.K. embroidered in one corner with pale blue thread. As she unfolded it, she saw the stain. It was a dark, rust-colored blotch, stiff and ugly against the delicate fabric. She rubbed it with her thumb, thinking it was mud or wine, but the texture was wrong. A cold dread washed over her as she realized what it was. It was old, dried blood. A floorboard creaked behind her. "What are you doing?" Wyatt's voice was not loud, but it cut through the sound of the rain like a whip crack. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her in over a month. Clara froze, her back to him, the handkerchief clutched in her hand. She felt his presence in the doorway, a wall of sudden, cold fury. I was just tidying," she stammered, turning slowly to face him. His eyes were not on her face. They were fixed on the handkerchief in her hand. The color drained from his face, leaving it a taut, gray mask. His pale blue eyes, usually so distant and weary, were now blazing with a terrifying light. "Put that down," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Don't you touch that." He strode across the room in 2 long steps, his limp more pronounced in his haste. He snatched the handkerchief from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a shocking, icy coldness. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His whole body was coiled like a snake, trembling with a rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small room. But the rage was a fire that burned out as quickly as it had ignited. It left behind nothing but ash and desolation. He stared down at the small square of fabric in his hand, and his shoulders, which had been rigid with anger, began to slump. The fury in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a wave of such profound and bottomless pain that Clara had to look away. He made a sound, a choked, guttural noise deep in his throat, and sank to his knees. He did not cry as he had that night on the porch. This was worse. This was a silent, complete collapse. He knelt on the damp earth floor, his head bowed, his body shaking with noiseless sobs. He clutched the handkerchief to his chest as if it were a living thing, a last, precious piece of a shattered world. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her own heart pounding in her ears. The rain drummed on the roof, a relentless funeral beat. She wanted to run, to flee from this raw, naked grief. But she couldn't. She was bound to this man, to this house, to this sorrow. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered herself to the floor, sitting on an overturned crate a few feet away from him. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She simply sat, a silent sentinel, and waited for the storm inside him to pass. A long time passed. The gray light in the room began to fade. Finally, the shaking subsided. He remained kneeling, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was a wrecked and broken thing, a barely audible whisper directed at the floor. Her name was Sarah. The words hung in the air, sacred and terrible. Clara held her breath. "She made that," he whispered, his thumb stroking the embroidered initials on the cloth. "For the boy. Samuel. Our son." He took a ragged breath, a sound of immense effort. "It was the throat fever. Came on fast, started with the boy. He was only 4. He choked on the words, his body tensing again. He couldn't breathe. His throat was closing up. Sarah. She sat with him for 3 days and 3 nights, wiping his face, trying to get him to drink." He lifted his head then, and for the first time, he looked at Clara. His eyes were ravaged, red-rimmed chasms of memory and guilt. "This," he held up the handkerchief. The stain seemed to darken in the dim light. "This was from the last day. He was coughing, and blood came up. I was trying to clean his mouth. He was so small. Clara, so small." The use of her name, the first time he had ever spoken it, was as shocking as a touch. It made her a part of his story, a witness to his agony. "He died in my arms," Wyatt continued, his voice flat and dead. "And Sarah, she had held it together for him. She was so strong, but when he was gone, she just crumpled. The fever took her 2 days later. She didn't even fight it. She was ready to go." He fell silent. The story told. The rain on the roof was the only sound, the whole monstrous emptiness of the house, the broken crucifix, the hidden photograph. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. He hadn't just lost a family. He had held them in his arms and watched them be stolen from him by a cruel and senseless sickness. Clara found her voice. It was a whisper, but it was clear. "Samuel," she said, "and Sarah." Saying their names aloud felt like an act of profound importance. It pulled them out of the realm of ghosts and made them real. Wyatt flinched, as if the names themselves were a physical blow, but he also seemed to settle. The tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. He had shared the source of his wound, and in the heavy, sacred silence that followed, Clara felt an opening, a space for her own story. Her pain was a different shape from his. It was not the sharp, tearing agony of death, but the slow, grinding erosion of shame. "My husband," she began, her voice quiet and steady. "His name was Elias. He was not a gentle man." Wyatt looked at her, his gaze shifting from his own past to hers. He was listening. He wanted a son, more than anything. It was all he spoke of. He believed it was his right, a sign of God's favor, and when, after a year, I did not conceive, he grew angry. She chose her words carefully, the truth of them a bitter taste in her mouth. He saw my body as a field he had to plow, whether the ground was willing or not. He thought he could force life to take root every month. When my time came, it was another failure. My failure. He made sure I knew it. She looked down at her own hands, twisting them in her lap. It was not an act of love. It was a duty, a chore he performed with a cold and bitter resentment. It was a violation, not just of my body, but of my spirit. He made me feel like I was broken, a faulty piece of equipment. She finally looked up and met Wyatt's gaze. She saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not pity, understanding. "The day he left," she continued, "he stood in the street and told everyone I was barren. He said it loud enough for the whole town to hear. He unmanned himself. He claimed, by being tied to a fruitless woman. And then he rode away. My own father believed him. Everyone did. I was worthless. 30 silver dollars was my price. The last of her story fell into the silence. They were two statues in the twilight, a man kneeling in the wreckage of his past, and a woman sitting in the shadow of her shame. His was a grief of presence of faces and memories he could not forget. Hers was a grief of absence of a life she was never allowed to have, of a worth she was never granted. But it was all grief. It was all loss. Wyatt slowly, carefully, folded the small, stained handkerchief. He reached into the trunk and placed it back beside the little wooden horse. He closed the lid, not slamming it in anger, but lowering it gently into place. He did not put the broken lock back on. He pushed himself to his feet, using the edge of the trunk for support. He stood looking down at her for a long moment. The rain outside was starting to soften, the angry drumming turning into a steady, hushed whisper. "Your husband," Wyatt Kane said, his voice raspy but clear, "was a fool." And in that moment, something shifted. A single thread of connection was woven in the dark, damp room. It was not love. It was not even friendship. It was something more elemental. It was recognition. Two souls, adrift in a vast and silent wilderness, had finally, truly, seen each other. The morning after the confession broke clear and clean. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the world washed and glistening. The air, stripped of its dust, was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet sage and damp earth. When Clara stepped outside to fetch water, the rising sun set the puddles in the yard on fire with golden light. The world felt new, as if it had been granted a reprieve. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted as well. The suffocating tension that had defined their shared space was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, a quiet heavy with the memory of what had been exposed. When Wyatt came in from his early chores, he met her eyes for a fleeting moment. There was no warmth in his gaze. Not yet, but the hard, defensive wall was gone. In its place was a raw vulnerability, an exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back. It was enough. Words did not return to the cabin. The silence settled back in. But its character had changed. It was no longer a silence of avoidance and distance. It was a silence of respect, a shared space built around the fragile truths they had offered each other. They had seen the deepest wounds the other carried, and they had not run away. A new language began to form between them, a language of small, quiet gestures. It started a few days after the storm. Clara woke, as she always did, in the pre-dawn chill. Her first task was always to coax the fire back to life from the glowing embers in the hearth, a frustrating chore that often involved fumbling with an axe in the half-light to split small pieces of kindling. But on this morning, when she went to the woodpile beside the hearth, she found a neat stack of thinly split, dry pine waiting for her. It was perfectly sized, ready to catch a spark. She stood for a moment, looking at the small, thoughtful pile. He must have done it the evening before, after she'd gone to sleep. It was a practical, simple act, but she knew what it was. It was an apology for his rage. It was a thank you for her quiet witness. It was an acknowledgement of her comfort, her daily struggle. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the sting of tears that were not born of sorrow. She built the morning fire, and its flame felt warmer than usual. She felt a deep, unfamiliar urge to answer in kind, to give something back. But what could she offer? Her work was her payment, the fulfillment of her contract. To mean anything, the gesture had to be something more than duty. The answer came to her that afternoon as she was mending his work coat. It was a garment of incredible toughness and wear, stitched and patched in a dozen places. She found a fresh tear near the shoulder, long and jagged. Normally, she would have sewn it up with the thick, rough thread she used for everything, but instead, She went to her own small bundle and took out the spool of fine cotton thread she had saved, the thread she had once used for embroidery. It was a foolish extravagance. The fine thread would not hold as long against the hard work he did. But it was an act of care. She spent an hour on the repair, her stitches small and neat, almost invisible. She reinforced the seam from the inside with a piece of softer cloth. When she was finished, the mend was a faint, clean line, a scar that was stronger than the original fabric. She hung the coat back on its peg. He would probably never notice the difference, but she would know. That evening, he came in from the fields, and as he hung his hat, his hand brushed against the shoulder of the coat. He paused. He ran his fingers over the mended seam. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at her, but she saw his shoulders tense for a moment before relaxing. He said nothing. But the next morning, beside the pile of kindling, there was a bucket of fresh water from the well, saving her the first cold trip of the day. And so it went, a silent conversation, spoken in acts of service. She would find a tool he had been sharpening left on the table and would wipe it clean of oil and place it back in its proper place. The next day, she would find that the heavy wooden bucket she struggled with had been fitted with a new, smoother handle that didn't cut into her hands. When she baked bread, she began to save him the heel of the loaf, which she noticed he preferred, setting it aside for his dinner. In return, she started to find that the heaviest sacks of flour and cornmeal had been moved from the floor to the table, within her easy reach. These were small, almost invisible things. Anyone else would have seen only the mundane rhythm of two people sharing a space. But to Clara, they were everything. Each gesture was a word, a sentence in their silent language. I see you. I see your struggle. I am here. For a woman who had been defined by her uselessness, to be seen in this way was a powerful, transformative thing. One evening, she fell asleep in the chair by the hearth, her mending still in her lap. The fire had burned low, and the cabin had grown cold. She had been waiting for him to return, a habit she had developed without realizing it, a need to know he was safe from the vast, dark wilderness. She woke with a start, not to the cold, but to an unfamiliar warmth. A heavy wool blanket was tucked around her shoulders. It was not her own thin, rough pallet blanket. This one was soft, thick, and smelled of lavender and cedar. She recognized it instantly. It was from the trunk. It was Sarah's. Clara sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. He was asleep in his bed, his back to her. He must have come in, seen her sleeping in the cold, and gone into the trunk, his sacred, wounded space to find something to keep her warm. He had taken a memory of his wife and used it to comfort her. The intimacy of the act was staggering. It was more intimate than any touch, any word. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her mind reeling. He was letting her in, not just into his house, but into his grief. She sat there for a long time, wrapped in the warmth of a dead woman's blanket, feeling a profound and terrifying shift in the foundation of her world. The culmination of their silent conversation came several weeks later, on a night much like the one that had broken them open. A fierce, howling storm blew in from the north, throwing sheets of icy rain against the cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the timbers of the small house groaned under the assault. But this time, the storm was only outside. Inside, a fragile peace held sway. A fire roared in the hearth, and Clara was at the table, kneading dough for the next day's bread, her hands covered in flour. The warmth and the rhythmic work were a comfort against the fury of the storm. Wyatt was on the other side of the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a counterpoint to the howling wind. The fire in the hearth was the heart of the home, its warmth pushing back the cold and the dark. It was Clara's domain. She tended it, fed it, kept it alive. It was the central duty of her contract. She noticed out of the corner of her eye that the flames were beginning to die down, the glowing logs collapsing into embers. She made a mental note to add more wood as soon as she was finished with the dough. wiping her floured hands on her apron. She was about to stand up when Wyatt moved. He stopped his work, stood, and walked to the woodpile. He selected a thick, heavy log of oak, one she would have struggled to lift. He carried it to the hearth. He took the iron poker, settled the embers, and then, with a careful, deliberate motion, he laid the log into the heart of the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney, and the flames leaped up, instantly brighter, hungrily licking at the fresh fuel. He had never done that before. He chopped the wood. He stacked it. But the fire itself was hers. It was a boundary they had both silently respected. By placing that log on the fire, he had crossed it. But it was not an intrusion. It was an offering. He was no longer just the man who had bought her to keep the fire. He was sharing the task. He was helping her keep the home warm. It was a quiet declaration that this was no longer just his shelter and her workplace. It was a space they were tending together. He placed the poker back in its stand and turned. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the newly strengthened firelight. His expression was calm, his pale eyes holding hers across the room. Clara stared back, her hands still in the dough, her heart doing a slow, heavy turn in her chest. In his eyes, she saw it all, the acknowledgement of her work, the respect for her presence, the shared responsibility for their small, fragile world. She could not speak. He did not need her to. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the same gesture he had given the morning after his confession, and went back to his rifle. Clara turned back to her dough, her hands resuming their rhythmic pushing and folding. But she was no longer seeing the flour and water. She was seeing a life she never thought possible, a life of quiet dignity, a life lived not in the shadow of a man's judgment, but in the steady, unassuming light of his respect. Later that night, as she lay on her pallet, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, she listened to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle steadily inside. For the first time she could remember, she felt safe. It was a feeling so foreign, so long absent. She had forgotten its name. It was not happiness. It was not joy. It was something quieter, deeper. It was peace, a profound and simple peace that settled into the marrow of her bones. She had been sold as a barren woman, a worthless thing. But here, in this empty house with this broken man, in the language of firewood and folded blankets, she was beginning to feel something take root inside her. Something she had long ago been told she could never grow. Hope, the peace once found, was a fragile thing. It existed in the quiet spaces between them, in the unspoken language of their daily routines. It was a tender, new growth in a barren land, and like any such thing, it was vulnerable to the elements. The first frost of the season arrived not as a gentle dusting of white, but as a bitter, cutting wind that carried the promise of a hard winter to come. It was on one of these cold, brittle nights that the rain returned. It was not the cleansing downpour of weeks before, but a mean, sleeting rain that froze as it hit the roof and the ground. The wind drove it against the cabin walls in sharp, angry bursts. Inside, the fire in the hearth fought a valiant but losing battle against the chill that seeped through the chinks in the logs. Clara lay on her pallet, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, listening to the twin sounds of the howling wind and the crackling fire. Wyatt was at the table, methodically oiling a set of leather harnesses, his face a mask of concentration in the lantern light. The shared, comfortable silence they had built was still present, a small circle of warmth in the vast, stormy darkness. Then a new sound began. Drip, drip, drip. It was a slow, deliberate sound, cutting through the chaos of the storm. It came from the corner of the roof directly above her pallet. At first, it was just an annoyance, but the rhythm was maddeningly persistent, each drop landing on the packed earth floor with a soft, wet thud that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. She shifted, trying to ignore it, but the sound seemed to grow louder, a tiny punctuation mark at the end of every gust of wind. Drip, drip, thud. Wyatt's head came up, his hands stilled on the leather. He listened, his head cocked, his pale eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. He looked from the ceiling to her pallet, his expression grim. The leak was not just a nuisance. It was a breach, a failure of the shelter he was responsible for. Without a word, he stood up. He went to the door and pulled on his heavy work coat, the one she had so carefully mended, and his hat. He picked up a lantern. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Sitting up." The question was out before she could stop it. "There's a loose shingle," he said, his back to her. "It needs fixing." Now, in this, she couldn't keep the alarm out of her voice. The wind outside shrieked, and a gust of icy rain rattled the door in its frame. "You can't go out there. It's freezing." "A small leak becomes a big one," he stated, his hand on the door latch. It was not a discussion. It was a declaration of fact. "Wait until morning," she pleaded, getting to her feet. "It's too dangerous. You could slip." He ignored her, lifting the latch. A blast of frigid, wet air burst into the cabin, making the fire dance and gutter. In that moment, a wave of something fierce and protective rose in Clara. It was an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Before she could think, she crossed the room and put her hand on his arm. "No," she said, her voice firm. "Please, don't." It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate intent. His arm, hard as oak beneath the thick coat, went rigid. He froze, his hand still on the door, and slowly turned his head to look at her. In the flickering light, his eyes were wide with a startled, unreadable expression. Her hand on his arm was a brand, a sudden, shocking point of heat and connection in the cold room. He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. For a long moment, the entire world seemed to be contained in that small cabin, the roaring storm outside, the sputtering fire inside, and the silent, charged space between them. He relented. With a slow, deliberate motion, he closed the door, shutting out the storm. He let his hand fall from the latch. He did not, however, shake her hand from his arm. "It will rot the beam," he said, his voice low and rough, as if he were explaining his actions to himself as much as to her. "We can fix the beam in the daylight," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "We can't fix you if you fall." He stood there for another long moment, the tension humming between them. Finally, he gave a single, stiff nod. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding and released his arm. The absence of his presence where her hand had been was a sudden, aching cold. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg. He walked back towards the fire, moving with a strange, restless energy. The leak continued its steady, relentless rhythm. Drip, drip, thud. Wyatt stopped and looked up at the spot, his jaw tight with frustration. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, and the inability to act was a kind of torment for him. He was shivering. His shirt was damp from the blast of rain when he'd opened the door, and the cold had settled deep into his bones. His hands, hanging at his sides, were trembling. Not just a slight tremor, but a visible, uncontrollable shaking. It was the cold, the frustration, the lingering shock of her touch. Seeing him like that, stripped of his usual stoic control, Clara acted on pure instinct again. She took a step towards him. "Your hands are freezing," she said softly. Before he could protest or retreat, she took both of his hands in hers. The shock of the contact was electric. His hands were large, rough, and icy cold. They were the hands of a man who worked the land, covered in calluses and old scars, and they were trembling violently in her grasp. Her own hands were smaller, softer, and warm from the fire. She wrapped her fingers around his, trying to impart some of her warmth into his frozen flesh. He went completely still. He stared down at their joined hands as if he had never seen them before. She could feel his pulse, a frantic, hammering beat against her palms. She began to gently chafe his hands, her thumbs moving in slow circles over his skin. It was a simple, nurturing gesture, the kind a mother would give a child. But as she stood there, warming his hands, The nature of the moment began to change. Her touch was not just about warmth, it was about comfort, and his acceptance of it was not just about the cold, it was about a desperate, unspoken need. He slowly lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. The world fell away. The sound of the storm, the dripping of the leak, the crackling of the fire, it all faded into a distant hum. All that existed was his gaze. She saw everything there she had only glimpsed before. The terrible pain of his loss, the crushing weight of his guilt, the profound and aching loneliness that had been his only companion. But underneath it all, she saw something new, something that her presence had kindled a tiny, flickering ember of hope. And she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that he was seeing the same things in her. Neither of them knew who moved first. It was not a decision. It was an inevitability, a force as powerful and elemental as the storm outside. It was a slow leaning in, a magnetic pull that had been building since the day of their confession. His head lowered, and hers tilted up. The first touch of their lips was hesitant, uncertain. It was cold from the rain and impossibly soft. It was a question asked in a language neither of them knew they spoke. For a heartbeat, they remained that way, poised on the brink of a terrifying, beautiful precipice. Then, something broke open inside both of them. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, desperate collision of need and solace. All the unspoken words, all the silent gestures, all the shared pain and fragile understanding of the past weeks poured into that single, desperate act. It was not a gentle or practiced kiss. It was clumsy and urgent, filled with a hunger that had been starved for a lifetime. She tasted the rain on his lips and the loneliness on his soul. His hands, which had been trembling, suddenly grew still and strong, his fingers lacing through hers with a crushing intensity. Her free hand came up to cup his jaw, her fingers scratching against the rough stubble of his beard. He made a low sound in his throat, a sound of surrender and relief, and pulled her closer. It was a kiss of survival. It was the first drink of water after a lifetime in the desert. It was the first warmth after an eternity in the cold. It was a promise, not of a future, but of a present. A promise that in this moment, they were not alone. Just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. They broke apart, gasping for breath, their chests heaving. The sounds of the world rushed back in the wind, the rain, the fire. They stared at each other, their eyes wide with shock and the terrifying wonder of what they had just done. The air between them was no longer silent. It was thick and electric, charged with 1,000 unspoken questions. Wyatt was the first to look away. A dark flush had crept up his neck. He released her hands as if they had suddenly caught fire and took a half-step back. He looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time, his gaze landing on the broken crucifix on the wall. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his breathing still ragged. He turned and walked to his side of the room without a word. He sat on the edge of his bed, his back to her, a rigid, unmoving silhouette. Clara stood frozen by the hearth, her own body trembling. Her lips burned. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his, the roughness of his skin under her fingertips. She raised her fingers to her mouth, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, terrifying joy. She turned and went to her own pallet, sinking down onto the blankets. The leak continued its patient, rhythmic dripping into the pot she had placed beneath it. But now, it was no longer the loudest sound in the cabin. The loudest sound was the deafening, roaring silence between a man and a woman who had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The next morning, the air in the cabin was thick with a new kind of tension. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate awkwardness, their bodies like planets that had been knocked from their orbits, now struggling to avoid a collision. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. Every routine act was now a minefield. When he reached for the coffee pot at the same time she reached for the skillet, their hands brushed, and they both recoiled as if they had been burned. But they could not avoid each other forever. Inevitably, their eyes would meet across the small space, and in those fleeting, stolen glances, everything was different. The quiet understanding was still there, but now it was layered with something new, something wild and dangerous. It was the memory of the kiss. It was a raw, naked awareness of him as a man, and of her as a woman. It was a question that hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in its uncertainty. The fragile peace was gone, but in its place was the promise of something far more potent and far more perilous. The days that followed the kiss were a study in quiet torment. The air in the cabin, once a space of shared, understood silence, was now stretched thin and tight, humming with the memory of what had passed between them. They moved with a new and painful awareness of each other, their bodies magnets that both attracted and repelled. A dropped spoon, a door held open a second too long, the accidental brush of his sleeve against her arm as they passed in the narrow space, each was a small explosion in the stillness, sending shock waves through their fragile world. Wyatt retreated even further into himself. The wall of silence he had briefly lowered was rebuilt, higher and more formidable than before. He barely looked at her, and when he did, his gaze was shuttered, his expression a mixture of confusion and a deep, guarded fear. Clara understood. That single desperate kiss had breached a truce they hadn't known they'd made. It had introduced a dangerous and unpredictable current into the calm, sad waters of their existence. It had reminded them both of a world of feeling they had each, for their own reasons, sworn off forever. Clara's own heart was a tangled knot of fear and a wild, unfamiliar hope. She found herself watching him constantly, studying the line of his back as he worked, the way his hands moved, the rare moments when a flicker of some deep emotion would cross his face before being ruthlessly suppressed. The memory of his lips on hers was a constant, burning presence, a secret she carried that warmed her from the inside out. Then the change began. It started as a simple, profound weariness, a fatigue that settled not just in her muscles, but deep in the marrow of her bones. She would wake in the mornings feeling as though she had not slept at all, her body a leaden weight she had to drag through the day's chores. She attributed it to the changing season, the harder work of preparing for winter. But this was a different kind of tired, an exhaustion that came from within, untethered to the labor of her hands. Soon after, the nausea began. It came upon her in the mornings, a rolling, sour wave in the pit of her stomach. The smell of salt pork sizzling in the pan, a smell that had been the scent of sustenance for months, now made her turn away. A hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a gag. She learned to hide it, to time her cooking so she could step outside for a breath of crisp, clean air when the feeling became overwhelming. She would stand behind the cabin, her head bowed, breathing deeply until the sickness passed, praying he wouldn't notice. Her body, it seemed, had become a stranger to her. Her senses were heightened, amplified to a painful degree. The scent of the dry sage on the wind was overwhelming. The smell of Wyatt's leather gear, of wood smoke clinging to his clothes, was so powerful it made her dizzy. She felt tender, raw, as if a layer of her skin had been peeled away, leaving her exposed to the world in a new and startling way. Her first thought was that she was ill, a fever, perhaps, or some sickness festering in her gut. The fear was a cold stone in her stomach. In this isolated place, a serious illness was a death sentence. She watched Wyatt from across the room, a terrible question in her mind if she became a burden, unable to cook or keep the fire. Would he cast her out? Would he leave her to the wilderness, just as Elias had? But as the days passed, a new thought began to surface. It was a thought so impossible, so contrary to the fundamental truth of her existence, that she barely dared to give it shape. It was a ghost of a hope, a whisper in the deepest, most secret part of her soul. She had been a wife for 2 years, and every month, her body had faithfully, cruelly, signaled her failure. Every month had been a fresh confirmation of the word that had become her name, barren. She began to count the days. It was a silent, frantic calculation she carried with her through every waking moment. She marked the passage of the sun, the slow thinning of the light as autumn deepened. She remembered the night of the storm, the night of the kiss, and she counted forward from there. 1 week passed. The weariness deepened. The nausea became a constant, unwelcome companion. She kept her secret locked away, a terrifying and precious thing. The silence in the cabin became her shield. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision, her mind a whirlwind of counting and praying and dreading. The new distance between her and Wyatt, born of their awkwardness, now served her as a hiding place. He was so lost in his own turmoil, so determined to avoid her gaze, that he did not see the subtle changes in her. He did not see the new shadows under her eyes, or the way she sometimes paled and swayed when she stood up too quickly. The 2nd week passed. The bleeding did not come. The realization did not arrive in a flash of lightning. It seeped into her, slow and steady and undeniable, like water soaking into dry ground. She was standing at the well, the rope cold and rough in her hands, hauling up a bucket of water. The late afternoon sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and in the quiet stillness of that moment, the truth settled upon her, not with a crash, but with a profound and soul-shattering certainty. The word Elias had branded her with, the curse her father had sold her for, the medical fact that had defined her worthlessness. It was a lie, all of it, a lie. She was not barren. She was not a dry field. She was not a broken vessel. She was carrying a child. Her knees went weak. She leaned against the cold stones of the well, the bucket of water forgotten at her feet. A wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to tear her apart, washed over her. There was terror, sharp and immediate. What would this mean? How could she possibly have a child here, in this desolate place, with this broken man? But underneath the fear was something else, something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. It was joy, a wild, fierce, triumphant joy that rose in her like a flood. She was not broken. She was whole. Life, which she had been told her body would forever reject, had taken root inside her, in the barren ground of her own being. A miracle was growing. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach, a gesture of awe and reverence. There was a life in there, a tiny, secret heartbeat that was a testament to the night of the storm, to a moment of desperate, unthinking connection that had somehow defied all logic and reason. For several more days, she held the knowledge close, letting it settle and strengthen within her. The truth gave her a new kind of confidence, a quiet, internal power she had never known. The nausea, the weariness, they were no longer signs of sickness, but affirmations of the life she carried. Her secret was no longer a source of fear, but a wellspring of strength. She was no longer just Clara Mayfield, the cast-off woman. She was a mother. She knew she could not keep it from him forever. This truth was too large. It would change everything. It belonged to him as much as it did to her. The child was a part of him, a continuation of the family he had lost, a possibility he had long ago buried. She owed him the truth, and she had to be the one to tell him. She could not allow him to simply notice the changes in her body, to have the truth dawn on him slowly. She had to claim this miracle as her own, to speak it into existence between them. She chose the evening. The work of the day was done. A stew simmered over the hearth, filling the cabin with the savory scent of herbs and meat. The wind had died down, and a profound stillness had fallen over the land. Wyatt sat at the table, cleaning a saddle buckle, his movements methodical and slow. The lantern cast a warm, golden glow over the room, creating an illusion of domestic peace. Clara's heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands and walked to stand before the hearth, her back to the fire, facing him. "Wyatt," The sound of his name, spoken aloud in the quiet room, made him start. He looked up from his work, his expression wary. It had been a long time since either of them had initiated a conversation about anything other than the most practical of matters. She had rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times, but now they all fled. She looked at his face, at the lines of grief and loneliness etched there, and she felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. This news would either save him or destroy him. She took a deep breath. "There is something I must tell you." He put the buckle and the cleaning rag down on the table, giving her his full attention. His pale eyes were searching her face, trying to read the source of her strange solemnity. "I believe," she began, her voice a little more than a whisper, but clear and steady in the quiet room, "that I am with child." The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper and more profound than any silence that had come before. It was as if the world had stopped turning. Wyatt stared at her, his face completely blank. He did not seem to be breathing. For a long moment, she was afraid he had not heard her. Then he blinked, a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A look of utter, profound disbelief dawned in his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried again. "That's not possible," he finally managed, the words rough and coated in disbelief. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't be, the letter, your father. He said you were barren." He said the word not as an accusation, but as a statement of indisputable fact, a truth upon which his entire world was built. He was not looking at her with anger, but with the stunned confusion of a man who has just seen the laws of nature overturned. Clara did not flinch. She did not look away. The fear she had felt was gone, replaced by the calm, unshakable certainty of the life growing inside her. She had been defined by the words of men her entire life, her husband, her father, and now him. But their words had no power over this new truth. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of mockery or triumph. It was a smile of quiet, revolutionary grace. "Perhaps," she said softly, her voice filled with a strength he had never heard before. "I do not need to be believed to carry life." Wyatt did not speak for the rest of that night. He sat at the table, staring at the wall, the words "I am with child" echoing in the space between them. Clara's quiet smile, the unshakable certainty in her voice, had done more than just state a fact. It had taken the world as he knew it and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. He was a man who dealt in the harsh realities of the land. A fence was either broken or it was not. A cow was either healthy or it was sick. A woman was either fertile or she was barren. He had built his new, empty life on these hard truths, and she had just told him the very foundation was a lie. He slept on the floor that night, moving his bedroll to the far side of the cabin, as if he needed the distance to comprehend the impossible. Clara lay on her own pallet, her hand resting on her stomach, a fierce, protective instinct awakening within her. She was not afraid of his disbelief. The truth of the life inside her was a shield, an anchor in the storm of his confusion. The change in him came slowly, like the turning of a great, heavy wheel. The next morning, he watched her. It was not the guarded, avoidant glance of the weeks before, but a new kind of look, intense, searching, and filled with a profound and bewildered awe. He watched her move about the cabin, his eyes lingering on her waist, as if he could will the proof of her claim into existence. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted the coffee pot, the faint blue veins beneath the skin of her wrists. He noticed the way she paused to catch her breath after sweeping the floor, a subtle weariness he had previously mistaken for simple fatigue. He was a rancher. He knew the signs of new life. He had just never believed he would see them in her. Weeks passed, and the charged silence between them slowly transformed again. It became a silence of shared anticipation, of a miracle too profound for words. The awkwardness was replaced by a new, tender carefulness. He began to leave a pail of fresh milk from their single cow by the door for her every morning. He started talking, not to her, but to the space she occupied, narrating his day in a low, quiet murmur as he worked on his gear in the evenings. He spoke of a coyote he'd seen, of a fence that needed mending, of a storm brewing in the mountains. He was filling the silence, building a world of words for the child who was coming. The moment the impossible became real for him happened one evening as they sat by the fire. The first snow of winter had begun to fall, thick, silent flakes drifting past the window. Clara was sewing, mending one of Samuel's tiny shirts she had found in the trunk, letting out the seams for a child that was yet to be. She felt a sudden, strange fluttering in her womb, like the beat of a moth's wings. It happened again, stronger this time, a definite, distinct movement. She gasped, dropping the needle. Wyatt's head shot up, his eyes instantly alert. "What is it? Are you all right?" She couldn't speak. She simply took his hand, a bold, unthinking gesture, and pressed his large, calloused palm against the gentle swell of her stomach. His hand was stiff, uncertain. He started to pull away. "Wait," she whispered. They sat in silence, his hand resting on her belly, the warmth of his skin seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. For a long moment, there was nothing. A look of disappointment began to cloud his face. And then, it happened. A firm, unmistakable kick directly beneath his palm. Wyatt's entire body went rigid. His eyes widened, the pale blue of them suddenly vast and deep. He looked from her stomach to her face, his mouth slightly agape. He had felt it, the proof, the undeniable, living truth. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, staring at it in wonder. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the hard mask of his grief crumble away completely, leaving behind the man from the photograph, the man full of hope and wonder. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "Samuel," he whispered, the name a prayer, and in that moment, the child was no longer just hers. It was theirs. But their sanctuary, built of silence and sorrow and a budding, impossible hope, could not remain untouched by the world forever. They were running low on salt, flour and coffee. A trip to the nearest town, a dusty settlement called Redemption, was unavoidable. The journey was different from her first ride to his ranch. He had procured a gentle mare for her, and they rode side by side. The tension between them was gone, replaced by a quiet partnership. He was constantly looking over at her, a worried, protective frown on his face, asking if she was tired or needed to rest. Redemption was a single, dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church. As they rode in, a hush fell over the small town. Heads turned. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Wyatt Kane, the grieving recluse who hadn't been seen in town for more than a year, was back, and he was not alone. Clara kept her head high. Her pregnancy was more apparent now, her condition no longer a secret she could hide, but a gentle, curving truth. She felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her, curious, judging, speculative. The women, in particular, sized her up, their gazes lingering on her belly, their lips pursed in silent calculation. Whispers followed them like a cloud of dust as they dismounted in front of the general store. The news traveled with the speed of a prairie fire. It leaped from the store to the saloon, from the blacksmith to the church sewing circle. A lone rider heading north carried the story with him, and a week later, the gossip found its way to the town nearest her old home. The barren Mayfield girl, the one sold for the price of a horse, was pregnant by the widower Kane. The consequences of that gossip arrived on a cold, clear afternoon. A lone rider approached the ranch. It was an old man, a trapper named Silas, who sometimes passed through the territory. He shared their fire and accepted a bowl of stew, but his eyes were troubled. I come with a warning. Wyatt, he said, his voice low. Words come down from the north. About the girl. He nodded towards Clara, who sat listening, her heart turning to ice. Her people heard the news. Her father, Josiah Mayfield, and her brothers. They're saying you've brought a great shame on them. They're saying he was cheated, that the girl was damaged goods, and now they're saying you've shamed their name by proving them liars. Wyatt's body went still, his hand resting on the coffee cup on the table. What are you saying? Silas. I'm saying they're coming, the old trapper said, his voice grim. Josiah sent his 2 boys. They were in redemption yesterday, asking questions, making threats, talking about or claiming their family's honor. You know what that means. They ain't coming to talk. After Silas left, a heavy, dangerous silence descended on the cabin. Clara's newfound peace was shattered. The ghosts of her past, the men who had discarded her, were coming to destroy her future. Wyatt stood up and went to the mantel above the hearth. He took down his rifle. He checked the action. His movements economical and deadly serious. He began to check his supply of ammunition. He was preparing for a siege. He was preparing to fight, to defend her, to defend their child. His quiet, deadly preparations were a declaration louder than any words. He was claiming her. He was claiming their child. He would protect them with his life. A fierce love for this silent, broken man swelled in Clara's chest. But as she watched him, a different feeling began to take root. A cold, hard anger. She had spent her entire life in fear of these men, her father, her brothers, her first husband. She had bent to their will, suffered their judgment, and accepted their verdict of her worthlessness. She had hidden in the shadows of their shame. No more. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. Wyatt stopped what he was doing and looked at her. His expression a mixture of confusion and concern. No, she said again, standing up to face him. Her hand went to her belly, a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. We will not hide. We will not wait for them here like criminals. I have done nothing wrong. Clara, they're coming to do us harm, he said, his voice a low warning. This is not a debate. It's a fight. I know, she said, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. But it's my fight. It's my shame they're talking about. I've spent my whole life running from it. I will not run anymore. I will not hide the truth of this child as if it's something to be ashamed of. He is a miracle, not a disgrace. She took a step closer to him, her resolve hardening with every word. We are not going to fight them with guns. Wyatt, we are going to fight them with the truth. I'm going to town. They have to see. See what he asked, bewildered. See that they can hurt you. No, she said, and a serene, powerful calm settled over her. They have to see me. They have to see this child. They have to see that their words and their anger have no power here. They built my life on a lie, and I am going to show them the truth. He stared at her, at the woman who had arrived at his door, a broken, silent thing. He saw the steel in her spine, the absolute certainty in her eyes. This was not the timid girl who had been sold. This was a mother, fierce and unafraid, defending her child not with violence, but with a courage he had never witnessed before. He slowly, deliberately, put the rifle back on the mantel. All right, Clara, he said, his voice filled with awe. We'll go to town. The next day, they rode back to Redemption. They rode side by side, not as a man and his property, but as partners, a united front. As they came to the rise overlooking the town, they saw them, 2 men, broad and familiar, standing in front of the saloon, her brothers, Jacob and Thomas. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not falter. She looked at Wyatt. He met her gaze, his own face set and grim, but he gave a small, firm nod. He was with her. They rode down the main street. Once again, the town fell silent. But this time, the silence was not just curious, it was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew why her brothers were here. Everyone was waiting for the violence to erupt. Clara ignored them all. She focused on the two men waiting for them. As they drew closer, she could see the fury on their faces, the shame and confusion warring in their eyes. They had come to drag home their disgraced, barren sister, but they were faced with this woman, her belly swollen with life, riding proudly beside a man who looked ready to die for her. They stopped their horses in the middle of the street, a dozen yards from her brothers. The whole town was watching. Clara did not speak. She did not need to. She simply sat tall and straight on her horse, her worn dress unable to conceal the impossible truth of her condition. She lifted her chin and met her brother's furious glares. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she rested her hand on the curve of her belly. Her action was her answer. Her presence was her victory. Her life, growing within her, was the truth that struck down all their lies. It was a testament to hope blooming in the most desolate of places, a miracle that no amount of hatred or shame could ever undo. In the stunned silence of the dusty street, surrounded by astonished eyes, Clara Mayfield finally, truly, claimed her own life. The ride back from redemption was a long, silent procession under a darkening sky. The hollow victory in the dusty street had left a bitter taste in Clara's mouth. They had met the challenge with quiet dignity, but the looks on her brothers' faces, the raw, curdled mixture of shame and impotent fury, promised that this was not over. They had been publicly shamed, their authority and their father's word made a mockery of by the simple, undeniable truth of her swelling belly. Men like that did not let such things go. They would seek their honor back, not with words, but with the violence that was their only true language. Wyatt rode beside her, his body a tense line of vigilance. He said nothing, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the rolling hills, the rocky outcrops, the deep shadows that bled across the landscape as the sun sank. He was a man anticipating a storm, and Clara knew it was not just the one gathering in the bruised, purple clouds overhead. They reached the cabin as the first cold drops of rain began to fall. The wind was picking up, a low, mournful moan that promised a hard night. The fragile peace of their small home felt like a distant memory. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a position to be defended. Without a word, Wyatt began his preparations. He did not ask her, he simply acted. He brought the horses into the small, sturdy lean-to that served as a barn, giving them extra feed and water. He carried in enough firewood to last for 2 days, stacking it high beside the hearth. He barred the door not with a simple wooden latch, but with a heavy iron beam he lifted into place. He checked the wooden shutters on the 2 small windows, ensuring they were secure. Finally, he took his rifle from the mantel, along with a heavy Colt pistol from a box under his bed. He laid them on the table, along with a box of cartridges, and began to methodically clean and load them. Clara watched him, a cold dread coiling in her gut. This was real. The threat was not a phantom. It was a physical presence they were now fortifying against. She did what she could, moving with a heavy, deliberate slowness. She lit the lanterns, filling the cabin with a warm, steady glow against the encroaching darkness. She put a pot of coffee on the fire to boil, the familiar, comforting scent. A small act of defiance against the fear. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They were 2 soldiers in a silent trench, waiting for an attack they both knew was coming. Hours passed. The storm hit with full force. The wind shrieked and battered the small cabin, and a driving, icy rain hammered against the roof. The world outside was a roaring chaos of blackness and water. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a lone bastion of warmth and light. Wyatt sat in a chair facing the door, the rifle across his lap, his face carved from stone in the flickering light. Clara tried to sew, but her hands were trembling too much to guide the needle. She eventually gave up, sitting on her pallet, her arms wrapped around her belly, as if she could physically shield her unborn child from the hatred that was gathering in the dark. It was close to midnight when the first sign came, Their horse in the lean-to let out a sharp, panicked whinny, a sound that was almost swallowed by the wind. Wyatt was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands, his body perfectly still, listening. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. They didn't have to wait long. There was no knock, no warning. There was a sudden, tremendous crash as two heavy bodies slammed against the barred door. The iron beam held, but the wood of the door itself groaned and splintered. "Cain!" a voice roared from outside. Thick with whiskey and rage, it was Jacob, her eldest brother. "You send out that whore. She's coming home to face her father." Another crash, heavier this time. A crack appeared in the thick planks of the door. Wyatt did not answer. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the log wall. His rifle pointed at the splintering wood. His face was a grim, pale mask. "She ain't your property, Cain." It was Thomas's voice now, higher and more frantic. "She's ours. She's shamed us all." The door shuddered again, and this time, the top hinge tore loose with a screech of tortured metal. The door sagged inward, held only by the beam and the bottom hinge. Clara scrambled to the far corner of the room, behind the table, trying to make herself as small as possible. A sudden, sharp pain, like a hot knife, lanced through her lower back. She gasped, her hands flying to the spot. It was a cramp, she told herself. It was fear. It couldn't be anything else. It was too soon. A heavy boot kicked through the cracked wood of the door. Then another. They were breaking it apart, piece by piece, through a newly formed hole. Clara saw the glint of a lantern and the wild, rain-slicked face of her brother Jacob. In that moment, Wyatt acted. He fired the rifle. The explosion inside the small cabin was deafening, a roar of thunder that shook the very floorboards. A scream of pain and surprise came from outside. The boot disappeared from the hole. But they were not deterred. An instant later, the muzzle of a pistol was thrust through the hole, and a shot rang out, wild and unaimed. The bullet tore through the roof, sending a shower of splinters down. Another, more powerful cramp seized Clara, this one wrapping around her belly like an iron band. It was so intense it stole her breath. She doubled over, a low groan escaping her lips. This was not fear. This was something else. This was her body, turning on her at the most terrible moment imaginable. The attackers changed tactics. A heavy log, used as a battering ram, smashed against the weakened door. The iron beam buckled, the bottom hinge ripped free. With a final, splintering crash, the door flew open, and 3 figures stumbled into the room, silhouetted against the raging storm. Her 2 brothers, and another man from the town she vaguely recognized. They were soaked to the bone, their faces twisted with drunken fury. Wyatt fired again, this time with the pistol. The 3rd man, the stranger, cried out and fell back through the doorway. But Jacob and Thomas were on him, a tangle of desperate, flailing limbs. The rifle was knocked from Wyatt's grasp, skittering across the floor. A lamp was overturned, and the room was plunged into a terrifying dance of shadows and firelight. Clara saw it all in a series of horrific, slow-motion flashes. Wyatt, fighting with a cold, desperate fury. Thomas, swinging a heavy bottle that shattered against the wall. Jacob, pulling a long hunting knife. Wyatt drove his fist into Thomas's face, sending him staggering back. He turned just as Jacob lunged with the knife. Wyatt twisted, and the blade sliced across his shoulder instead of his gut. A dark stain immediately bloomed on his shirt. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. He brought his arm around and slammed his pistol against the side of Jacob's head. Her brother crumpled to the floor, stunned. Thomas, recovering, saw the rifle on the floor. He dove for it. Wyatt, Clara screamed. Wyatt turned, his face pale, his arm slick with blood. He saw Thomas scrambling for the rifle. He started to raise his pistol, but as he did, a searing, white-hot agony exploded in Clara's belly. It was a pain so immense, so all-consuming that it ripped a scream from her throat. A wave of warmth gushed down her legs. Her water had broken. The sound of her scream, a sound of pure, primal agony, cut through the chaos of the fight. Wyatt's head snapped towards her. His eyes, for a fraction of a second, were filled not with the fury of the fight, but with a new and different terror. In that moment of distraction, Thomas got his hands on the rifle. He swung it around and fired from the floor. The bullet caught Wyatt high in the chest, spinning him around. He staggered back against the wall and slowly slid to the floor, his eyes wide with shock, a dark, spreading stain blossoming on his chest. The sight of him falling, of the life draining from his face, broke something in Thomas. The drunken rage in his eyes was replaced by a look of horrified, sober panic. He had not meant for this. He dropped the rifle as if it were a hot coal, scrambled to his feet, and hauled his dazed brother Jacob out of the cabin and into the storm. And then they were gone. The roar of the wind and rain rushed in to fill the silence. Clara was alone, in a wrecked and violated home, with the man she loved bleeding on the floor, and a child fighting its way into a world of violence and death. Another contraction seized her, an unrelenting, grinding wave of agony. She crawled to Wyatt's side. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, glazed with pain. "Wyatt," she sobbed, grabbing his hand. "It was cold. Stay with me, please." His eyes found hers, a flicker of recognition. "The baby," he whispered, his voice a wet rattle. "Clara, the baby!" "It's coming," she gasped, the words torn from her by another wave of pain. "It's coming now." She had to move. She had to survive. For the child. For him. She dragged herself back to her pallet, taking Sarah's blanket, the one he had given her, and bundling it beneath her. The fire was dying, the room growing cold. The wind howled through the broken doorway. The next hours were a blur of blood and pain and prayer. She was alone, lost in a primal, agonizing struggle that was as old as time itself. The storm outside raged, a mirror to the storm within her own body. In the moments of rest between the crushing waves of pain, she would look over at Wyatt. He was still, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were open, fixed on her. He was holding on, a silent, bleeding witness to her ordeal. She prayed, not to the God of her father, a God of judgment and wrath, but to the vast, silent spirit of the land, to the ghost of the woman whose blanket she lay upon, to the fierce, new love that had taken root in her heart. She prayed for strength. She prayed for the life of her child. She prayed for the life of the man who had shown her she was not worthless. The world narrowed to a single point of tearing, all-consuming agony. She bore down, a scream tearing from her throat, a sound that was one with the wind. There was a final, terrible wrenching, a release, and then silence. A terrifying, breathless silence. The baby lay still and silent between her legs. For one heart-stopping second, Clara was certain she had lost everything. And then it came, a thin, reedy wail. Yet it was the most powerful sound in the universe. It cut through the howling of the storm, a defiant cry of life in the face of death. Sobbing with relief and exhaustion, Clara reached down and pulled the slippery, warm body up onto her chest. She wiped the baby's face with a corner of the blanket. It was red and wrinkled and perfect. It was a boy, her son, the impossible child. She looked over at Wyatt. His eyes were closed. For a terrible moment, she thought he was gone, but then his eyelids flickered. His gaze found the small, wailing bundle in her arms. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime and blood on his cheek. His lips moved, forming a single silent word. "Samuel." Dawn broke gray and tender, the light of a new wound spreading across the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly broken. Inside the cabin, the air was cold and smelled of wet earth, gunpowder, and blood. The wind no longer howled. It whispered through the shattered doorway, a mournful sigh for the violence the night had held. Clara sat on the floor, her back against the cold log wall, the baby wrapped in her torn petticoat and held tight against her chest. He was asleep, a small, warm weight of impossible life. Every muscle in her body screamed with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness. But beneath the pain and the weariness, a core of hard, unyielding iron had formed in her soul. She had survived. Her son had survived. Across the small room, Wyatt lay where he had fallen. The dark, ugly stain on his chest had spread, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His face, in the pale morning light, was the color of ash. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was already gone, but then his eyelids flickered, and his gaze, unfocused and clouded with pain, found her and the bundle in her arms. He was alive. For now. Survival was a brutal, simple calculus. Fire, water, bandages. Clara knew, with a clarity born of pure desperation, that if she did not move, they would all die. She laid the sleeping baby carefully on her pallet, tucking Sarah's blanket around him, then, moving with a slowness that felt like wading through deep water, she forced her battered body to obey. She tore strips from the hem of her dress, her only remaining garment of any length. She found the whiskey bottle Thomas had thrown, miraculously unbroken in a corner. She crawled to Wyatt's side. His eyes followed her, filled with a helpless, fever-bright intensity. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. The wound in his chest was a nightmare. It was high, near the collarbone, and bubbling with every shallow breath he took. She did not know what to do. She had seen men shot before, but never like this, never when their life was in her hands. She did the only thing she could think of. She poured the raw, burning whiskey over the wound, and he let out a choked, hissing gasp, his body arching in agony before collapsing back to the floor. She packed the wound with the cleanest strips of her dress, creating a thick, desperate bandage that she tied as tightly as she could. The knife wound on his shoulder was a long, deep gash, still sluggishly weeping blood. She cleaned and bound that one too, her movements becoming more steady, more sure. A cold, clear purpose was burning away her fear. He had fought for her. Now, she would fight for him. She spent the rest of that day and the next in a waking nightmare. She rebuilt the fire, feeding it with wood from the precious indoor stack. She found a bucket that was not riddled with bullet holes and fetched water, her body screaming with every step. She spooned broth and water between Wyatt's pale, cracked lips. He drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, murmuring names she did not know, his body sometimes shaking with violent chills. In the quiet moments, when the baby slept and Wyatt was still, she would sit and hold the pistol, watching the broken doorway, her ears straining for any sound. But her brothers did not return. They had fled their own carnage. On the third day, Wyatt's fever broke. He woke in the late afternoon, his eyes clear for the first time. He looked at her, then at the sleeping baby beside her, then at the clean bandages on his chest and shoulder. He tried to speak, but only a dry cough came out. Clara brought him a cup of water. He drank, his hand trembling as he held the cup. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice a ghost of what it had been. "We stayed," she corrected him softly. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for it, but in the quiet understanding that passed between them, a final wall crumbled. He had bought her to be his servant. He had fought for her as his own. She had nursed him as her husband. The contract was null and void, replaced by a bond forged in blood and fire and the cry of a newborn child. Wyatt's recovery was slow and agonizing. The bullet had missed his heart, but it had shattered his collarbone and torn through his lung. For weeks, every breath was a struggle. The deep wound in his shoulder began to heal, but it left behind a knot of scarred muscle that promised a lifetime of pain and weakness. he would never again have the full strength of his right arm. He was a man permanently marked by the night his son was born. As he slowly regained his strength, they both came to the same unspoken conclusion. They could not stay. The cabin was a tomb, its walls saturated with the memory of violence. The broken door was a constant, gaping reminder of their vulnerability. The very ground felt poisoned. One afternoon, as he sat propped up against the wall, watching her rock the baby, he spoke. "I know a place. To the west, there's a small lake, fed by a mountain stream. The water is always clear. Things grow there." He didn't need to say anything more. She simply nodded. It was time to leave the ghosts behind. Their departure was a silent funeral procession for a life that was over. They had almost nothing to take. They loaded what little they had, a few pots, an axe, the remaining sacks of flour and beans, and Sarah's trunk onto the back of the single horse that had not run off during the attack. Wyatt, pale and weak, insisted on walking, leaning heavily on a staff, his right arm in a sling Clara had fashioned. Clara walked beside him, the baby, whom they both now called Samuel, strapped to her chest in a makeshift carrier. They did not look back. They simply walked away from the place of their sorrow and their beginning, leaving the sagging, empty cabin to be reclaimed by the wind and the dust. The journey took them 4 days. It was a slow, arduous trek through a harsh but beautiful landscape. At night, they would build a small fire, and Clara would tend to Wyatt's wounds. He would watch her, his eyes filled with a quiet, wondering gratitude. She would catch his gaze, and a new, gentle warmth would spread through her. The fear and the pain were slowly being replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of their new family. The place he had spoken of was more beautiful than she could have imagined. It was a small, hidden valley, a slash of impossible green in the midst of the brown and ochre landscape. A small lake, its water the color of a summer sky, was nestled among a stand of tall cottonwood trees. The air smelled of green, living things and clean water. It felt like the first day of creation. They started again from nothing, with his one good arm. Wyatt felled small trees, and together they built a new home. It was smaller than the first cabin, but it was sturdy and tight against the wind. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and hope. They cleared a small patch of land, and Clara planted the few seeds she had found in the bottom of a sack. Life was hard. It was a daily struggle for the most basic of necessities, but it was a shared struggle. In the evenings, they would sit by the door of their new home, watching the sunset paint the surface of the lake with fire. Wyatt would hold Samuel, his scarred hand surprisingly gentle, and Clara would lean her head against his good shoulder, a profound and simple peace settling over her. Word of what had happened that night in the cabin eventually filtered back to Redemption. The story was told in whispers in the saloon and over fences. The tale of how the 2 Mayfield boys, drunk and full of rage, had attacked the Kane ranch, and how they had come back empty-handed and terrified, leaving a trail of blood behind them. They had left town the next day and were never seen in those parts again. The townspeople, who had once stared at Clara with judgment and suspicion, now spoke her name with a kind of grudging, silent respect. They left the new family alone. They understood, in that unspoken way of the West, that some people earn their peace, and that sacred ground should not be trespassed upon. And so, the legend began. It was a story that travelers and trappers would carry with them, a tale that would be told around campfires for years to come. It was the story of the silent, grieving rancher and the barren woman he had bought for 30 pieces of silver. It was the story of how she, who was said to be a worthless, empty vessel, had faced down hatred and violence, and in the heart of the most desolate land, in a cabin shattered by blood and rage, had brought forth a new life. They said she was a woman who could make the desert bloom. Sometimes the land lies, but a woman who dares to love can make it tell the truth. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to share our thoughts together. Please consider subscribing to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and support us further by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.